Well, it's so nice to be with all of you. Can you hear me? Great. It's so nice to be with all of you, to see so many familiar faces, and I hope that today the conversation is affirmational for those of you who are actively thinking and working in this space of equity in your offices and in perhaps even your volunteer commitments in the community. Cindy gave me a very gracious introduction, and I am very passionate about equity in technology and equity in entrepreneurship. And the title of today morphed into equity in entrepreneurship because, quite frankly, we're talking about a culture shift for all of us, regardless of the industry, because of the population demographic shifts that we're seeing in our country and globally, and the economic impact that Cindy alluded to, where there are over 1 million jobs that are going to go unfilled if we can't step up how we think about training our workforce, which really gets into our K-12 and higher ed initiatives. We are leaving money on the table, and we are contributing to a lack of not only economic equity in our country, but we are contributing to our incapacity to compete competitively in a global marketplace because we can't staff up aggressively enough. How many of you are facing challenges in finding the right people for open positions right now? So for those of us who are actively managing in this space, it's hugely challenging. And when unemployment levels now are lower than they've been since the Great Recession, it's hard to comprehend why we don't have enough people, enough qualified people applying for these jobs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all of this. And I'm going to make a couple of book recommendations. But before I get into this, let me first thank Cindy and all of you at Missouri Venture Forum for being open to this conversation. And I hope that you can join me and partner with us at Arch Grants and with other institutions working toward this issue of equity and entrepreneurship as agents of change in our community. I hope today when you walk away, you have better fodder for conversations with your HR offices and your management teams. I hope you have fodder for conversation that lends itself to robust cocktail conversation, that's constructive in this deeply divisive time in our country because of the election. And I hope you recognize and can partner with us in the impact of policy in the state relative to how we are perceived nationally and internationally when competing for talent. Because if we don't own that, we're fooling ourselves, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. I also would be remiss if I didn't say, Rebecca and Ian, well done. And you are with a peer group of people who appreciate the magnitude of what is required to start a business. So good luck, and may you continue to do well and build a great brand in St. Louis for St. Louis. We really do appreciate it, so thank you. America's demography is changing, and the nation's economic fate will hinge on how we respond to these changes. The population, as we know, is growing more diverse, and today I'm going to talk about the math so that you understand, that we all understand that we're working with the same framework for those numbers. This isn't anecdotal, it's mathematical, it's right there. How many of you have children in school right now? K-12. How about university? If you're working in those environments as a parent, you're seeing what I'm about to talk about. The classrooms in this community and across the United States and around the world look very different than this room. And the differences are profound. The differences are also not threatening. They're to be celebrated, and we have to figure out how to do that better as employers. As the population grows more diverse and people of color become the majority, because we're talking about a minority-majority country in the United States soon, equity, which is fair and just inclusion, is an urgent economic imperative. Reversing the trends of rising inequality and stagnant wages and ensuring that everyone can participate and prosper are critical to building a strong and competitive economy for the United States for decades to come. This is especially true in St. Louis. Were any of you at the Fed this week with me? They have a series that they offer where they drill down into economic initiatives, and this week they happen to be talking about St. Louis and the state of our economy. So I'm going to share with you a little bit from that conversation because it's directly relevant to our theme today. In St. Louis, our GDP trails Kansas City and Springfield. Our standard of living in St. Louis has stagnated since 2009, and we have experienced very little labor force growth in recent years. Currently, our GDP in St. Louis is back to pre-recession numbers, but those pre-recession numbers are still significantly below the national. Many employers say, as we alluded to this morning, that they cannot find enough qualified employees. This negative is really a tremendous opportunity. And I hope by the end of today, we can figure out together where we go. It doesn't mean it happens fast, but if we can first acknowledge the problem, I think we have a better shot at fixing it. Yep. So this slide, I know today there was a conversation, does she mean equity or does she mean equality? And that tension is generational, and I mean equity. I was raised talking about equality. As a professional in business, we need to shift to equity. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about empathy, because in our best selves, none of us, I believe, would suggest that we aren't empathetic. However, how we practice and how we model empathetic behavior in our offices and how we manage empathy, especially in hiring and management of what are very complex teams now, really matters. We need to cultivate empathy, actually, in our offices. And I have resources that we will send out after today's presentation that I hope will enable you and all of your teams to be able to develop empathy. We may hear first-person accounts of what it's like to experience discrimination or to be disenfranchised, and we in this room may have personally experienced what it means to be discriminated against or disenfranchised. But I think we need to cultivate and remind ourselves the depth of that damage when it happens. Recently, I came across the Just Cities essays published by Next City. If you're not familiar with that group, they're worth a read. And they provide a vision for urban equity, inclusivity, and opportunity. And how many of you are familiar with the term moral imagination? This was new to me, and I was surprised given my background in political science, but it was a concept conceived by Edmund Burke. And it's the idea that our ethics should transcend our own personal experience and help us to embrace the dignity of the people around us, because we're all people. Our experience may not be the same, but we are all one human race. When we look at the disparities in our country and in St. Louis, it is evident that so much of the disparity is rooted in policy. And I would argue it's been rooted in policy created by people who perhaps lack moral imagination. One can see an absence of thought or consideration for the humanity of other people depending upon their zip code, depending upon their ethnicity, and we see it rooted in our policy. So much of which, I'm thrilled to say, is being addressed, not as aggressively in some communities as I would like, but to look at how our municipal court reform is happening counts. If we can jettison the word equality from our approach to management and business, we need to also give equal consideration to stop using the word others. There are no others. We are one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And I know some of you would say under God, and my mother, if she were here, would say under God, and I would say to Mom. That was not in the original version. It was adopted in 1942. Visually, what do I mean, the difference between equality and equity? If you've not seen this graphic, some people love it, some people hate it. I think it's effective, so I don't have an opinion other than to say I'll use it because I think it's effective. That's the difference. And that's why I would like us to stop using the word equality. Economists, business leaders, and elected officials increasingly recognize that inequality is hindering economic growth, and racial and economic inclusion are the drivers of robust economic growth. And this was mentioned at the Fed this week. Federal economists cannot provide a presentation on the benefits of equity. That's not in their language. But when they're evaluating cities against one another, they know that this issue of equity is a major player. It's one of the 4 issues that they say will make or break a city's growth. To build a strong next economy, Leaders in the private and public sector need to advance an equitable growth agenda, which is an agenda. It's a plan. A strategy to create good jobs, increase human capabilities, and expand opportunities for everyone to participate and prosper. We have to start embracing diversity and equity as sources of growth, prosperity, and progress. They are not sources of division and strife. When they are couched that way, we are missing such opportunity, because equity will make America and this country stronger. We as a city of people need to cultivate the moral imagination to see our family members in the shoes of those experiencing inequity. Only then will things change. And I'm going to use the issue of gay marriage as a great example. Think of the evolution of gay marriage in this country and how much it has changed as people started to recognize that they were talking about people. Sometimes people in their own families, their churches, their schools, their neighborhoods, their offices. This is hard to read, so I'll read it to you. Equality is giving everyone a shoe. Equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. So imagine if we could harness our region's negatives. Think about how this city is portrayed in the national media. Outside of our startup community, which is, I think, remarkably positive. But think about the negatives. From Ferguson to the recent gun legislation, the LGBTQ, anti-LGBTQ policies that passed the Senate last year. They didn't make it through the House, but they passed the Senate, which means we show up in the same narrative as Carolina and Indiana. What if we could imagine an entirely different vision for our region that emphasizes the inclusion of women, minorities, and immigrants? Think of the economic impact of that. What if we made this the most welcoming community for women, minority, and immigrant entrepreneurs? We as business leaders can lead this work. Inclusion of women, minorities, and immigrants is in the best economic and civic interest of our community, and it's in the best interest of our businesses. And quite frankly, the reality is we have no other choice. It's not about being the right thing to do. It's not about personal values. This really is about good business that happens to also be the right thing to do. And there's a reconciliation happening, and our role as business leaders is to develop within ourselves the ability to listen deeply and to teach those on our teams to listen deeply. You can even call it radical listening. We also have a responsibility to call BS when we see it, and I mean that. For example, when I'm asked to be on a panel, I always inquire about who else is participating. If there isn't equity on that panel, I try to help create it, because so much of what we need to do is about opening our networks and connecting people to one another who wouldn't otherwise meet. Panel, if I can't help create the equity, then I can always choose not to participate. Anthropology. There's a little anthropology in all of this, right? Maybe a lot. And so how do we find our inner anthropologists? Because this is about people, human potential. It's not important how you see a person or how I see a person. Rather, it's important that we see the person and about how he or she identifies, because that's how we get the best out of people. That empathy, that understanding, that commitment. And it's how we inspire people. And at the end of the day, I think in most of our offices, we want to inspire people. And to Cindy's point about a generation where we don't have enough women coders, how do we inspire the next generation to aspire to jobs where they don't see themselves represented yet? There is fluidity to self-identity. It's not static for some, so it can't be static for us as managers. All this slide is saying is that racial identity has changed, and it's changing. And in 2013, the US Census Bureau found that about 9 million Americans chose 2 or more racial categories when asked about their race. Keep in mind that the Census Bureau didn't even allow Americans to choose more than one racial category until 2000. And since 2000, the nation's multiracial population has grown substantially. Between 2000 and 2010, the number of white and black biracial Americans more than doubled. And interracial marriage, remember, was taboo in the US. It was even illegal in some states until the Supreme Court declared that race-based restrictions on marriage violate the Equal Protection Clause of our Constitution. That came in '67, not that long ago. So as adults in this room, in our peer groups, it might be difficult to comprehend what I'm saying because of the relatively small share of all US adults today who are of mixed race. But we've got to reboot our thinking about this as managers and leaders in our organizations, because the future workforce does not look like this room. The future workforce looks very different, because if the current trends continue, and all the evidence suggests that they may accelerate, not just even continue, the Census Bureau projects that the multiracial population will triple by 2060. And today, nearly half of all multiracial Americans are younger than 18. So that gives us the context for why we've got to get equity right now, because this generation, this workforce that we desperately need to want to engage in our places of business to advance our work, we have to be ready to receive them. And in 2014, 2015, that school year marked the first time that students of color outnumbered Caucasian students. Authentically value the differences. I was challenged to do this last week. Has anybody been watching the challenges that the Contemporary Art Museum has been facing with its recent exhibit? So I have an employee who has been involved in that community response to the exhibit. And she needed time out of the office because she needed to have a conversation with the curator. And I said, okay. I said, you got to get your work done. And you know what, to be fair to her, I actually didn't even have to say that. She said, I'm going to get my work done. I said, great. If you have a problem, let me know. I can't have the team that I need in my office to do our work, which is this global startup competition, if I don't honor them when they ask me for something that is not the norm. In 1980, 80% of the population was white. By 2043, a majority of Americans will be people of color. In this community, from 1980 to 2010, people of color increased from about 18% to almost 25% of the population. And by 2040, in our community, over a third of our population will be people of color. And as we hire in our office, and I was thinking about this as I said, find your inner anthropologist. I'm fortunate to have 2 MSWs on staff, one of whom is in the room today. And when I came into this role at the end of 2013 and I met with our entrepreneurs shortly thereafter because it was part of their regular quarterly review, and these are gentlemen and ladies from around the nation and around the world, I said to my colleague Ben Burke, we need an MSW. Everybody in this room may understand what I'm saying, but when you're dealing with people and it's a high-pressure environment, at some point somebody needs therapy or counseling. Maybe you as the manager need it sometimes. I know I do. We finally got our first MSW on staff earlier this year in February, and we hired a second this summer. We have the George Warren Brown School of Social Work at Washington University. If you and your HR offices, as I'm talking about all this, aren't thinking strategically about how to get that talent into your offices, you might want to reconsider how you reach out for talent and the inclusion of people who are trained to work in diverse environments, as many of the social workers at the George Warren Brown School are trained. Change in population by race, it's numbers in a graph, it's self-explanatory, but people of color will exhibit the greatest growth rates in the St. Louis region from 2010 through 2040. The Latino, the Asian, and the multiracial populations are forecasted to experience the largest population growth with rates of upwards of 127%. Why does that count? Because how in your office are you, and me too, managing to anticipate this influx of talent that we want to make sure we have representation in our offices? And at City Academy, this was very true when we were graduating students, and bear with me, it was a program on the north side, one of the most disinvested neighborhoods in the city of St. Louis. And the premise was we could put a Saks Fifth Avenue of private education on the north side, and eliminate the barrier to a quality education and prove that children, regardless of their zip code, could achieve academic excellence? Well, we did. In partnership with a lot of philanthropists, we did. And the grit and the stamina of the kids and their families, we did. The point and the analogy I'm drawing is that as we were graduating these students, the expectation was that they would go into our phenomenal independent secondary schools in St. Louis, where scholarship had been stigmatized. And now I'm bringing in an entire population of children for whom scholarship has been celebrated. Do you see how that one piece, right, how we produce and receive can have a tremendous difference? Scholarship is a word, but how it is applied is how it is received. And we had a mismatch. And we hadn't anticipated the mismatch. And what it meant relative to that slide I just showed you was that as the students matriculated into these independent secondary schools, they didn't see anybody who looked like them, or they didn't see a density of people who looked like them to put them at ease as we were saying to them, don't worry, it'll be okay. Don't worry, it'll be okay. Don't worry, it'll be okay. So in your offices, what are you doing right now? What are we all doing right now to anticipate this influx of workers who are going to look potentially different than what you have now, so that when you want the best talent and they come into your office and they interview, who's going to receive them? So that they see someone or something that's representative of what they are expecting, and that they know it's going to be okay because they already see that the office is representative of a population or of people that makes them comfortable, that makes them immediately feel, I understand this office. It was a watershed moment for us at City Academy, by the way, when I could finally, and I remember the day, I walked into our founder's office and I said, we now have one graduate in every single one of the private secondary schools. That was huge. It meant that every time we sent a new batch in, there was one person there who could receive them. That power of one. So in our offices, we're not talking about huge shifts, right? Culturally, we're talking about a magnitude of order that is a huge shift, but it happens in incremental steps. But we know diversity in our workspace is so much more than race. And as Cindy alluded to earlier, the gender gap continues. And sexual orientation and experience, too. The Diversity Matters report from McKinsey, if you haven't seen it, it's a great read. It examined proprietary data sets for over 366 public companies across a range of industries, multiple countries. And that's important because obviously we're all doing business in a deeply connected and global world, a global economy. And it shouldn't come as any surprise that more diverse companies and institutions achieve better performance, but they do. And that's the equity and economics that we all need to be so aware of in our businesses, which at the end of the day need to make money. In the United States, there is a linear relationship between racial and ethnic diversity and better financial performance. They've shown it again and again. For every 10% increase in racial and ethnic diversity on the senior executive team, earnings before interest and taxes rise 80%. I'm going to read it again, because for me, this is it. For every 10% increase in racial and ethnic diversity on the senior executive team, earnings before interest and taxes increase 80%. Racial and ethnic diversity has a stronger impact on financial performance in the United States than does gender diversity. But that is not to suggest that we don't need to be equally as aggressive about having a gender balance on our management teams and in our offices, because depending upon where you are, 80 to 90% of consumer purchasing is done by women, right? Much of the financial decision making in a household is made by or directed by women. And while certain industries perform better on gender diversity and other industries on ethnic and racial diversity, no industry or company is in the top quartile on both. So there's an opportunity, right? If we could all achieve gender and racial diversity and equity on our teams, it's going to be to our benefit. So I know this is self-explanatory, but I'm going to say it because occasionally I'm called on something that it irritates me, so I'm just going to talk about it. It is rude. But more importantly, if the rude doesn't upset you as a manager in your business, it's costing you money. And we have to accept that the complexity of our reality demands a completely different logic. based on the math that I've shown you, based on what I've told you, based on what you're experiencing, if we continue to do the same thing and expect different results, we are crazy. So the complexity of what we're facing absolutely demands a different logic. And following the events in Ferguson, St. Louis was thrust into the national media, and the world is watching how we respond. And I really do think it's an opportunity for us as a community to fundamentally shift how we think about talent retention and development, and it's what makes Arch Grants so great, right? This global competition, about 50% of the companies are led or co-led by somebody who is from Missouri or St. Louis, and the other 50% are from around the nation and around the world. And in our portfolio of active companies, 70% are either led or co-led right now by a woman, a minority, or an immigrant. St. Louis can emerge from a lot of this negative publicity as a just city. It just requires all of us to keep doing the best of what we do and to challenge ourselves in new ways to cultivate the leadership we need to get to a place of equity that we just haven't ever seen in the city. But we can lead by example, and it doesn't have to be through negative headlines. The racial discrimination numbers, so this is important because I think I live in a rarefied space where I hope if my team were interviewed, they wouldn't have these issues, but it's important for us to remember that discrimination does exist. We have to be vigilant about modeling best behavior in our offices, and according to the 2010 data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, we still have unequal pay between the genders too. Earnings for women in 2010 were $669. Median weekly earnings for women were $669 and $824 for men. That's a 20% gap in wages. And the gap is larger between professional men and women, with women earning a median weekly salary of $923 to the men's median weekly salary of over $1,200. So we still have inequity in pay, which makes it especially difficult when you're trying to compete for talent. And if you have a single mom who has children and she's not being paid a salary commensurate with her male counterparts, well, she's probably not going to work for you. She's going to work for somebody who can pay her a higher wage because she's dealing with additional costs, right? There's a domino effect. And I know that when I was negotiating my salary at Arch Grants when I moved from City Academy, there were two people who interviewed me. I won't give you their names, one of whom is still on the board. And I said the number. And I think we as women have to teach each other, and the men who love us have to teach us how to have confidence in saying numbers. I see this in my own office. I see it with some of our companies. The gender differences sometimes aren't to our advantage in how we address them. And I worked really hard at being able to say that number out loud before I walked into the room. And the man choked, and the woman said very quietly under her breath, "Pay it." And I thought, did she just tell him to pay it? And she looked at me, and her eyes were, "Be quiet." So when we're in these rooms, as men and women managing teams, hiring, what are the cues that we're giving to each other? And what are we talking about behind the doors before we're building out teams and before we're anticipating growth and anticipating these new, workers coming into our offices? Are we really prepared to pay them? Are we really prepared to pay them to compete? And are we really prepared to have the equity in pay? And then how do we support each other? And how do we teach our employees that we want to keep how to continue to advance? Real briefly, the racial gap in households. So this is, to Cindy's point earlier, and it's why the City Academy Arch Grants continuum for me continues to really resonate personally and professionally. The gap in wealth in this country is our problem. We focus a lot on race, but the wealth gap is a huge issue. And in some communities, there just happens to be a correlation to race, right? People of color are not all poor. I hope we all know that. Oftentimes, I think that's what people hear. It's what the media portrays. It's not true.
But the wealth issue is true. We have a wealth issue. And we can normalize the wealth issue by getting more people wealth, which is why I like entrepreneurship, right? Theoretically creating new wealth. And people have to work really hard, and they have to demonstrate their grit and their tenacity, and hopefully it works. And sometimes it doesn't. But through the process, hopefully they have a network that enables them to find another job that offers them not a living wage, right? But a really competitive wage. With the minority majority upon us, it is economically more efficient for us to ensure equity in K-12 and higher education to ensure today's students are developing the technical and soft skills required in today's business environment. Sure, today. Honestly, do we really care about today? I do, because I'm managing through it. I do, because I'm leading through it. I do, because I'm parenting through it. I do, because I'm trying to manage a marriage through it. But when we're thinking about our businesses, today is challenging. I think tomorrow, right? We don't even know what's going to be required of us tomorrow. We don't even know what jobs will exist in this marketplace as fast as technology is changing. So preparing children to do this kind of work and to be nimble and understand how to work in teams and develop technical proficiencies, like Cindy said, coding, really important. The good news in St. Louis, the gap between job growth in our region as compared to the US has finally closed. That gap opened in about 2010. It has finally closed. The job growth we have experienced since the Great Recession in this town has been driven by professional business services. Many of you, accountants, attorneys, fintech. And they're typically higher paying jobs. The other driver of our economy, leisure and hospitality. Not as highly paid, but some very good jobs. And our employment rate has been below the national rate since 2011. So there's some good news. So why do we continue to see St. Louis be depicted as a place lacking equity? Because of our wealth disparities. Because of our wealth disparities and some of our entrenched racial trauma, I'll call it. Back to when my mic went out. And gender trauma. What would be the economic benefit if we could finally close our regional wealth and racial disparities? It's a big number. And I hope this is motivating to all of us too. Economists estimate that eliminating racial income gaps would boost the St. Louis economy by as much as $14 billion with a B. And we're complaining about how we can't get fire trucks for the city downtown. $14 billion. Bias. You can't read this, the slides will go out. It was just an interesting attempt to look at multiple ways that bias happens and we're not even sure of it. And you know, if we acknowledge and accept that 80 to 90% of our brain works unconsciously, it means we make snap judgments all the time. And a great academic study about this phenomenon is blind spot, hidden biases of good people. How do we correct for the blind spots? In management, and there's excellent research available, including a book entitled What Works? Gender Equality by Design. In that book, it's explained how one change in audition protocol for symphonies dramatically improved the number of women being hired. In 1970, only 5% of musicians in our nation's top symphonies were women. Today, women account for more than a third of the talent. The small change in protocol was that they started to have auditions behind a screen so that those listening could not see the gender. And I will tell you that that protocol has evolved such that now often they audition without shoes on because the judges could tell the difference between loafers and heels. Oh, I've got a good one too. Mary Jo's here with Prosper. I got to read this because to illustrate, I found this and I think it's telling because we do deal with this all the time at Arch Grants. And I keep hoping that it'll be less so. And I think it will as time evolves because I'm going to say something really lovely about white men in a minute. Investors prefer pitches by men, particularly attractive men, to those by women, even when the content of the pitch is exactly the same. In addition to studying the results of 3 entrepreneurial pitch competitions, the researchers conducted 2 experiments in which a representative sample of working adults heard identical pitches, one in a male voice, one in a female voice. 68% of people preferred to finance the company when it was pitched by the male. 32% chose the female. So I am here in large part because of white men. I was fathered by one. I have married one who has financed my career in nonprofits. I've given birth to 3. I have a vested interest in the health and wealth of white men. But you are about to become the minority. And the grace that white men have shown me and so many women and immigrants and minorities and people of color that I love, I desperately need you to rise to the occasion now, because you are still overwhelmingly in positions of power that people of color, women, and minorities don't have. So choose wisely, because the women and the minorities and the immigrants that are coming before you are likely to be your successor. They are likely to be the ones to whom you entrust the business that you've built. And they will do well by you. They will do well by you. But we need you to very, very thoughtfully select them so that you select the very best. Because as women and minorities and immigrants, we have to work twice as hard. And it's not because of any documented rationale. It's just typically how it goes. The white men in my life have coached me, they've counseled me, they have financed me. I adore them. Those of you in this room are here, I hope, because you're already down a continuum of thought on this issue. As a manager, as a father, husband, partner. This is a safe space to have this conversation in many respects. It's incumbent upon all of us then to take the information and apply it as best we can to model the behavior that we know is required to bridge the gaps that have been so persistent in this community and in other cities too, but so persistent in this community such that we are sacrificing $14 billion in potential economic gains. I believe, this is my last slide, that the St. Louis region has the opportunity to join a growing number of metropolitan areas that are proactively addressing issues of equity. Atlanta, Denver, Kansas City, Los Angeles, New York, and Portland, Vancouver, they have all developed equity mapping capacities. And those equity mapping capacities are helping to drive a next economy agenda. But we face some daunting policy challenges in Missouri. And I'm going to touch on a couple of these because this being an election year, I'm going to stay away from the party politics because the presidential campaign is one, but I'm worried about our state politics, most of all right now. In March 2016, as I mentioned, an anti-LGBT bill was passed by the state Senate. It was killed by a coalition of state legislators, but it was close. And that legislation may come up again. And because it passed in the Senate, as I said, we get lumped into the national conversation with Indiana, North Carolina, et cetera, which we can't afford. And here's why we can't afford it. Do policies like these really shape economies? They do. And if you're trying to recruit talent, you might even have people say to you, tell me about this. What's your position on this? How do you feel about this? We don't have great answers, right? Look to the coffers of Indiana and North Carolina, where it's estimated that North Carolina alone has thus far lost $395 million. And Indiana has thus far lost $60 million. And workplace discrimination in America, gender, race, it cost an estimated $64 billion, according to the Center for American Progress. There are so many decisions and actions required for a more equitable St. Louis region. But so many of those decisions start with us. And it's why I deeply appreciated the invitation to be here with you. Even if you don't agree with some of what I've said, I hope you embrace the notion that change is coming and that we each play a role in embracing that change to the benefit of our business. And in doing so well, it will change the reputation of the city. How we manage and model equity in our offices is how we start. And we can each do that. Other problems require new policy. And I'm going to encourage you to support the people who support the policy that you want. And in closing, I will remind all of us, there are 10 Fortune 500 companies in Missouri. 9 of them are in St. Louis. 1 is declaring bankruptcy, 1 is preparing for an acquisition. The money in this town matters to the state of Missouri. And yet policy out of Jefferson City would have us believe that they don't think that we know how much the money in this town powers Jefferson City and the state of Missouri. We would be wise to remind them in how we vote and the campaigns that we support. And I really don't care on what side of the aisle. I like to support logic. Much of what I've seen lately is illogical, and it is in the very worst interest of business. So only together can we make the change that we want to see. And I hope, as you get your teams around these major issues, you'll consider maybe starting the conversation with a book that everybody can read and you can talk about. And this was given to me by my dear friend Catherine Lovett Bryan Cave, who did not know that I was giving this presentation, and she just happened to coincidentally courier this over on Wednesday. Crossing the Thinnest Line, How Embracing Diversity from the Office to the Oscars Makes America Stronger. Read it, share it, and I hope in a year I get to come back because there's some epiphany that we can talk about in terms of how St. Louis is starting to be received as a community that is excited about developing talent among women, minorities, and immigrants, including the K-12, to Cindy's point, because we've got to get kids inspired to want the jobs that we don't even yet know exist, right? Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Ginger, thank you so much. That was very insightful. So to your point about K through 12 education, one of the policies is based on real estate taxes. Mm-hmm. So how do we go about changing that? Because people are moving to communities because they have good schools, but they only have good schools because they have a decent tax base. So talking about equity really starts with, why should my kid in Sunset Hills get a better public education than someone in Ferguson?
It's an excellent question. And I'm grappling with this myself on a personal level, having been a longtime St. Louis resident, city resident. So, Michelle, it's challenging because, yes, the property taxes, but what's interesting to look at is what we do with the money we have. So to reframe the question in the context of what do we spend per student is a much more interesting conversation. And to look district to district and compare their per student cost and their per student spending is also a very interesting conversation. Some of the most successful school systems, and I'll look at Singapore, for example, so obviously not in the United States, but they spend significantly less per child than what we tend to spend in the United States, and they get a better product. And I think one of the greatest challenges before us is not only what we spend per student and what it costs per student, but also in terms of teacher preparation. What are we doing in teacher training programs in higher ed to ensure that they have the skills they need to bring to the classroom the topical knowledge, the depth of expertise required for the kind of training that we need to see in K-12 education. Because K-12 education really hasn't undergone a massive overhaul since the Industrial Revolution, just so everybody knows. Like, that's kind of funny, given where we've been going as an economy. K-12 education hasn't experienced that same transformative experience. And so what's happened is that districts generally haven't had that external force to compel them to do what you do as business leaders all the time because of market forces. It's why when the chamber, both regional and state, come up with policy agendas around K-12 education, we need to read them as business leaders, and we need to make sure that we agree and then partner to the extent that we're able with those school districts, because that's where a lot of the change begins, is in how we advocate on behalf of our district, whether we have students in it or not, as parents or grandparents. How are we advocating for some of the change that is required? And when the school bond issues don't pass, and they haven't passed recently in Kirkwood or Webster Groves, that says a lot. So what are we doing as citizens if we're not passing it because we don't think they're being good stewards of the cash they have? Well, then what are we doing to ensure that that money that they do have is spent wisely? If we are passing them and you're uncomfortable about it, what are we doing in terms of transparency to validate that what they said they were going to do with the money is what happens with the money, right? It's easy when you see a building go up. It's harder when it's happening in the classroom in real time. So the issues are complex, but I think it gets back to who you're electing into office, and then how we're partnering with our schools and our chambers to try and drive policy and instructional curricula that is consistent with where we see the jobs coming. And right now, so much of that work happens in our community colleges, and it should be happening much earlier in K-12.
So one of the issues with regard to wealth disparity relates to the fact that the baby boom generation is 50-something to 70-something, and the folks that did the high labor stuff at the bottom of the pyramid that used to be middle-class jobs have long ago lost those jobs and are now essentially unemployable. The new economy is not something that they fit in. They're 50-something to 60-something years old.
Yep.
And they're grandparents and parents or whatever, and they don't have anything to pass down like my grandfather does for me. And so how do we fix or address or deal with that particular issue? I hear a lot about, the 35 and unders and K through 12s.
But age discrimination.
Well, it's not so much discrimination. It's just that their skills were labor-related in industry, and those jobs will never come back, and they are not translatable. I mean, you're talking about when I was younger, I had a secretary. There were file clerks. I don't have a secretary anymore. There are no file clerks anymore.
Yep.
There are no laborers. So
Ask a question.
sorry.
That's
I'm just
okay.
saying.
No, right. What a gentle audience, right? I appreciate the headspace you're in. So I think of it as two. I do actually think we have gender discrimination. I think when you're looking at filling a position, how open are we to people who are coming in who are wanting to train up or have just recently undergone retraining, but they're in their 50s, and you're looking for a position that you want to see somebody be in for the next 10, 15 years, and is that realistic? I think that is a real issue. I think also the expectations of employers have changed. So in the last 15 years, the idea that you hire somebody and train them up has changed dramatically today versus 15, 20 years ago, when that might have been a really realistic expectation on the part of the employer and the employee. Now what we see with employers is that they want to hire and have that person hit the ground and contribute day one in a really meaningful way. And that means, to your point about the skill development, there isn't that same on-the-job opportunity that there once was. And so what are we doing as employers to either shift that or to look at where that kind of on-the-job training is reasonable? And then to the extent that you partner with I hate to say it again, but the community colleges, they're tremendous partners. And when you have a real issue and the idea of partnering with that community college to come up with a curriculum that enables you as an employer to find the right people and train them up, they can be tremendous partners in that work, and they want to be.
So this is along the line of the K through 12. It's actually the pre-K.
So there's been a lot of research done in a lot of states to show if we invest in the pre-K area, it has a lifelong impact, and you can all find the research. We have a really great opportunity in our next election in Missouri. Missouri has some of the lowest enrollment in pre-K in the country. Again, well documented, this makes a huge difference. There is an amendment on the ballot. I would encourage you to educate yourself. It's called Raise Your Hand for Kids. You can just Google that. But it's raising the cigarette taxes, which we are the lowest in the country, maybe second lowest. I can talk about why that's a bad thing for the state. But it's taking a fund raise on taxes, cigarette tax, and applied only for pre-K education. I'm worried because the way the ballot looks, there's 2 raises for cigarette taxes on the ballot.
Interesting.
One is a little teeny one and one is bigger. You want to vote for the one that's the amendment to the Constitution. It can't be diverted to any other use except pre-K education. It's been really well crafted. So I encourage you, please educate yourselves. It's something all of us can do just by educating ourselves and going to the ballot box and telling our friends, and we can make an economic impact for our whole state. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, it is 9 o'clock, so I'm going to let one more question and then we're going to wrap it up. Soren, did you have a question?
So I'm interested to hear your opinion about how we can align the interest of the investors with the minorities. Because if you look at what the investors put their money in, it's what they know about. And the minorities,
Or who they know, what they know or who they know, right?
Fair enough. So the minorities come with ideas and concepts that are linked to their environment and what they know and what they would like to do. And practically you put the two together and there is a mismatch right there. So how can we educate the investors and how can we educate the minorities to present to the investors so we can have a cross and grow that way?
The most challenging, sort of what I would like to see is more immigrant investors. I would like to see the peer group evolve of investors in St. Louis such that the investors themselves are recognizing, Soren is an investor and is not of my same experience and background professionally or personally. Do you understand? Like, for me, what I see is the disconnect is because we have all these interesting people doing interesting work as entrepreneurs and inventors, and they don't necessarily look like or have the same experience or the same networks, as importantly, as those that they're going to ask for money. And what I would love to see in St. Louis is the immigrants and the minorities who have the potential to be investors come together and either form their own angel group, go with an existing angel group, but really start to address density within their own communities and their own shared experience to be able to assist this next generation of entrepreneurs coming. Because that hasn't been the tradition in St. Louis with our 2 relatively small angel groups. And Mary Jo is very much a part of an initiative, right, targeting women with women investors, so women entrepreneurs with women investors, and really managing that peer-to-peer experience very strategically. And it would be terrific to see similar initiatives to welcome and support and challenge a little bit, respectfully disrupt the establishment, but do so as a peer. And I think that's very different. We need more of that. Thank you.